Testing, 1, 2, 3, testing, 1, 2, 3. This is Radio Free Mormon on the air, broadcasting behind enemy lines. Tonight's episode, a look at the Truth and Light Letter. There has been a recent permutation of responses to the CES letter. Let me back up just a bit and say around 10 years ago or so. It's been quite a while now. Jeremy Reynolds put out his CES letter, which is a collection, a rather extensive collection of criticisms of the LDS Church and the Book of Mormon and things of that sort. It has had a massive, massive impact on membership resignation rates. And therefore, the apologists have taken it upon themselves to try and respond to this CES letter by Jeremy Reynolds in order to stanch the bleeding. Now, Jim Bennett, I know, did one. He did a response to the CES letter. Haven't read it. Like Jim Bennett, though. But the most recent iteration of responses to the CES letter is now making the rounds. It is being hailed as the silver bullet that will finally kill the CES letter by the light of the full moon. It is called the Truth and Light Letter. And therefore, the title of tonight's episode is A Look at the Truth and Light Letter. It's certainly not going to be an exhaustive response to the Truth and Light Letter, but I am going to take a look at it. And the reason that I finally decided to take a look at it is because I was going through my email the other day, and I have an email exchange going along with a gentleman named Phil McLemore. He is a former member of the church. He may still be a member of the church. I know he was a former chaplain in the military, and he's also very into meditation. I think yoga as well. He's not going to be a guest on the show, but he will be here by virtue of his emails to me. And one of the things I wanted to talk to Phil McLemore about had to do with the CES letter. Actually, he brought it up. And by CES letter, of course, I mean the Truth and Light Letter. He brought it up, and it was his bringing up in this email exchange with me that finally got my attention. And I decided this week to go and check it out because it is available online. Both the CES letter is available online as well as the Truth and Light Letter, both of them available online. And I want to read to you, first off, this exchange that Phil McLemore and I had in order to lead into this look at this at the Truth and Light Letter. I keep almost saying CES letter. It really is firmly entrenched in my brain, isn't it? CES letter. No, this is the Truth and Light Letter. So let me go to my emails with Phil McLemore. This goes back to August 28th of this year, but comes up to yesterday. It says, "Hello, RFM. My wife keeps up with church defenses," or in other words, apologetics, I think he means. "Lately, some of her gang are referring to the Light and Truth letter, which seems to be aimed at the CES letter and Mormon stories. I don't know if it is big enough yet for you and Bill to assess it." Well, it may not have been in August, but it might be in November. By the way, for the record, today's date being November 15th, 2024, that I'm recording this episode number 372 of Radio Free Mormon. "I don't know if it's big enough yet for you and Bill to assess it. I read over it today." This is Phil McLemore writing. "It is simply a rehash of old apologetics. My spidey sense tells me that this Austin Fife," now Austin Fife is the fellow who wrote this Truth and Light Letter. I almost did it again. The Truth and Light Letter. That's Austin Fife, Thane of Fife, son of Barney, perhaps. "My spidey sense tells me that this Austin Fife is the face of an apologetic group looking for a new venue in the context of a person who left the church." Okay, the story with Austin Fife is that he left the church because of anti-Mormon literature. Let's just put it that way. Mormon stories, I don't know. But he left the church 10 years ago, he says. And then he only recently came back to the church. I think he left, he says, in 2014, came back earlier this year in 2024, because he realized that all these criticisms that he had understood and caused him to lose his testimony before were all rubbish, and that now he has renewed his faith. He's got answers to all of these criticisms, and hence he's writing his book about all the answers to these criticisms called the Truth and Light Letter. Once again, Phil says, "My spidey sense tells me that this Austin Fife is the face of an apologetic group looking for a new venue in the context of a person who left the church, studied it all for 10 years, regained his testimony, and is back to defend. He avoids most of the serious issues. and quotes more from Reddit and other social media comments, many of them absurd, than from his supposed targets, Jeremy Runnels and John Dehlin. He does exactly what he accuses church attackers of doing, overwhelming folks with tons of information to give the appearance of substance. Signed, Phil. Well, I responded to him on September 4th and I said, I have heard a little bit about this pamphlet being bruited about the internet, but have never taken the time to look at it. I am sure it is being promoted as the latest silver bullet against the CES letter, one that is better to have than to use, because it isn't going to stop anything if you actually have to shoot it. Is it available online, do you know? Hope you're doing well, by the way. And on the same day, Phil responds to me, this is no pamphlet. It is a huge online document with tons of footnotes to give the appearance of scholarship. Go to lightandtruthletter.org. It is confusing at first since it looks like only the intro is available. You navigate through the whole letter by using the menu on the left side. By the way, thanks for that safety tip, Phil. That helped a lot. Saved me a lot of time. No way this guy did this on his own. That's Phil's opinion. Then Phil writes again to me, apparently in response to something I'd said on a podcast, I think. He writes, your theology is right and well expressed. How God became characterized by and how Christianity became a religion of shame, guilt, sin, threats, violence, and seemingly arbitrary judgments, reflecting the worst of human nature, is a tremendous tragedy. Jesus, in some of his collected sayings in the Sermon on the Mount, reveals a positive capacity in humans that is uplifting and aspirational. Then we teach a God who lacks these qualities. He says this is a bad thing. Then we, as Mormons, teach a God who lacks these qualities. Interesting comment, interesting insight from Phil. We create this church, we create this God who lacks all the qualities which we say are good and which we try and inculcate in our members. Fascinating. He goes on, thank heavens I can forgive, and I have been forgiven for offenses without me or someone else having to be tortured and killed. Am I better than God? This is obviously now to me in response to my observation that the great weakness at the heart of Christianity is that it seems to revolve around the idea that God has to butcher his son in order to be able to forgive other people of their sins, which is a strange thing, since I don't have to butcher anybody in order to forgive somebody else if they offend against me. Also, just so you know, Paul Toscano had something to say about that very issue and how it is he reconciles it on last Wednesday's Mormonism Live. All right. Going on, without God possessing these qualities, religion is going to be characterized by fear, and it's going to be used to control and manipulate others. Mormonism is one of the worst in this regard. I wrote back to Phil on September 20th and said, your comment made me think of something I saw recently from Jacob Hansen, where he was drilling down on Jesus teaching us to rely on outside sources of authority. And I thought, that is absolutely nothing like the Jesus I read about in the New Testament. LOL. I received a response from Phil to that on October 8th. He writes, yes, Jesus was clearly suspicious of outside sources of authority. I enjoyed your insightful conference commentary. He says, thank you, Phil. A few comments. Number one, there seemed to be a little evidence church leaders were going to shift from Book of Mormon being historical to just being inspired. If this began, it is clearly over, he writes. All conference talks that discuss the Book of Mormon do so from the old narrative of its actually being history. There is also a doubling down on the foundational narrative that is clearly in question. First vision, prophets always teaching truth and getting direct revelation from Jesus, etc. Number two, as my wife and I have been reading the Book of Mormon this year, we have been stunned how anti-inspiring it is. God as threatening, punishing, cursing, an actual hell being taught, etc. Most surprising is the number of passages that teach that Jesus is God the Father in the flesh. It's not one or two passages that we can finesse, but dozens of passages. So once again, you might want to check out last Wednesday's Mormonism Live for Paul Toscano's thoughts on that issue if you are interested in trying to make sense of LDS theology. All right, number three, I was asked to substitute in gospel doctrine class a few months ago, Phil writes. The topic was conversions in the Book of Mormon. The Gospel Doctrine Manual, along with current LDS leaders and scholars' teaching, states that quick awakening type conversions are not the norm and will not be experienced by most, if any, individuals these days. Yes, I've said something about that in the past on more than one occasion, I think. I took the opposing position in the gospel doctrine class. A dangerous move there, Phil. My position and questions to the class were, does it make sense that the Book of Mormon was written for our day? Book of Mormon tells us it was written for our day. We're always told the Book of Mormon was written for our day. That's why we need to be reading it. He asked, does it make sense that the Book of Mormon was written for our day to bring us closer to God, but all of the conversion stories in the Book of Mormon are not the wimpy line upon line conversions we promote today, but are quick, dramatic, and instantly life-changing. This is true for individuals and large groups. I then went into the core elements of these conversions and showed how each of us should be experiencing these. Using the parable of the workers in the vineyard, I granted that it might take all day or just an hour based on receptivity, but that the effect and impact would be instantly life-changing. Most agreed with visible joyfulness. This is the good news of the gospel. This is the good news of the Book of Mormon. However, the next week, the regular teacher contradicted me and went back to the slow, plodding, line upon line method of conversion. And finally, number 4, I agreed with you on Budge's attempts at a meditative perspective. Now, this has to do with my conference review. There was an elder who gave a speech, a talk. His name was Elder Budge. And what he talked about was meditation. That was strange. He talked about meditation. And what I had to say about it on my podcast was, it seems like he's talking about meditation. Now, I don't know a lot about meditation. I know a little bit about meditation. And I've even tried to practice it. When I used to go to church 10 years ago, in sacrament meeting, while the sacrament was being passed, this emptying of self, this not thinking of anything during meditation, which itself is its own discipline and not as easy as it might sound just to say it, but to actually still oneself and calm oneself and quiet oneself to the point where one is not thinking about anything. And therefore, you are open to whatever the universe may want to give you. All right. So I asked Phil about this, or he's responding to me about that. And I'm glad because Phil does know meditation much better than I do. But he agreed with me. So I'm glad of that. Thank you, Phil. I agreed with you on Budge's attempts at a meditative perspective. I really appreciated his movement in that direction. By the way, what I had said about it wasn't just that I knew a little bit about it, but that it seemed like Elder Budge was trying to take the concept of meditation, which is gaining some popularity in the world. You know, people talk about meditation. It's a positive thing. He's trying to take that positive idea of meditation and make it Mormon. Except when he applies it to Mormonism, it becomes anything but the meditation that it's supposed to be. It's not mindlessness or emptying. Mindlessness is probably the wrong word. Emptying of oneself, not thinking of anything. Instead, it becomes the absolute focus of one's thoughts on Jesus. Okay? Not the same thing at all. And Phil agrees with me. He says, I really appreciated his movement, Elder Budge's movement in that direction. However, the old wineskin of Mormonism cannot contain it. I've been teaching yoga meditation for over 20 years. If you are ever interested in discussing meditation from that point of view, let me know. And you let me know in the comments whether you'd be interested in such a discussion, because I'm sure Phil would be happy to come on. By the way, I did reach out to him and I asked him if I could have his permission to read his emails to me on the show. He said, fine. Just want to let you know that. And let me know if you'd like to hear more from Phil. It's been a while since he's been on. Okay, so then I responded on October 17th. I am heartened to hear you agree with me on Elder Budge's meditation Mormon style talk, because I knew I was out on a limb on that one, knowing so little as I do on the subject. I am starting to see a pattern, and this pattern I think is interesting. I am starting to see a pattern of taking things that those on the fringe or outside the church consider important and then trying to claim it as Mormon. And there's 3 of these things. Number 1, culture. Culture was talked about a few years back in a general conference talk, saying that the Mormon church culture is the greatest culture of all that goes back to the very beginning. The idea seemed to be in response, at least in part, to criticisms that Mormonism doesn't respect the culture of foreign populations where it is established. Solution: we have a culture too, the Mormons do, and our culture is the best of all cultures in the world that have ever been. Number two, integrity. So not only culture, but integrity. Integrity gets honorable mention every now and again in General Conference, saying that integrity is doing what you are told to do by your Mormon church leaders, not being true to yourself. So you can really only have integrity by being a faithful and observant Mormon. So not only has the church now taken culture and made it Mormon, they've also taken the idea of integrity and made it Mormon. By so doing, they also sort of twist the interpretation and understanding of those words while they're making them Mormon, as you can tell. And I conclude with, and now we come to meditation, number 3, which is no longer an emptying of self, but a continuous pondering on Jesus. All 3 of these examples have the LDS Church making no changes whatsoever. They simply seem to be identifying qualities and practices important to non-members and then claiming that those qualities and practices can be found in their true form only in the Mormon Church. Do you think I'm on to something? I ask. Which brought forth this final response that I'll be reading from Phil, and this was on November 13th, just 2 days ago. Number 1, Mormon culture is the best, ? Exclamation points. Not only does it not respect other cultures, and not all of them are great, the way it imposes itself on other cultures is pure arrogance. Although I do like a few aspects of Mormon culture, it tends to be rigid, narrow, Pharisaical, with a lot of play acting and disingenuousness. If you violate one of the sacred cows, the core narrative, inspiration of leaders, etc., you will be held in suspicion, shunned, and friendships abandoned. I mentioned this on one of the podcasts we did. Many of my lifelong close LDS friends no longer contacted me after they became suspicious. I no longer accepted the core narrative. Loyalty to church equals more important than family or lifelong friends, 5 exclamation points. Number 2, integrity. I brought up integrity, you remember. Woe unto you, you hypocrites. I don't know if you remember, but I concluded in one of the podcasts we did about my 50 plus years of church experience, 30 of those working for or representing the church, that there is a core of dishonesty that runs throughout the history of the church and the entire organization of the church up to the present. I referred to this as the dishonesty of Joseph Smith still in the bloodstream of the church. Mormonism has caused many leaders and members to violate character, conscience, and integrity to maintain the success, unity, and image of the church. People who are honest in virtually all other aspects of their lives will violate integrity to defend Mormonism. We have seen that over and over again, even recently, haven't we? Can you say Roger Clark? So yes, Mormon integrity is obedience, even if it violates character and conscience, honesty and ethics. This is also part of the culture, he says. Then meditation and Elder Budge. He has a few comments to make here. First, I don't know if you did so as a missionary, but if I were a mission president in a foreign country, I would be interested in dominant spiritual traditions and narratives. I was still a cautious believer when I began my meditation practice and journey. My personal identity was still so enmeshed in Mormonism, I had to take valuable new wine and find a place for it in Mormonism. Fortunately, when the wineskin split, I went with the new wine and not the cracked and no longer useful container. Next, I assume he saw or sees, this is Elder Budge, I think. I assume he saw or sees the spiritual value of quiet time and stillness. And even though it is powerfully present in Jesus and President McKay's sacred door quote, it is not authentically present in Mormonism. Hell's bells, language Phil. Hell's bells, he writes. I've been chased out of the celestial room many times for trying to sit contemplatively. If you have so much time, go to another session, I get told. McConkie defined worship as work. So for Elder Budge, to quote Elder Bednar, not a promoter of inner reflection, by the way, at this point, who essentially says being still is not being still, is absurd. Next, for Elder Budge, to then shift from higher meaning and greater spiritual awareness by being still, which is or can be absolutely true, to the checklist prayer, scripture, study, temple, which is what Elder Budge does in his talk, which doesn't work and has not worked, is also absurd. To his credit, he asks us to approach the checklist items with deeper mindfulness and focus, but this is meaningless without direct instruction to do so, which we will not do and which leaders fear. Why? It can create spiritual independence. Can you spell George Pace? Well, yes, I can, especially when it's written right here on the screen in front of me. Just a few more comments. I love the Martha Mary contrast, Phil writes, and use it often in meditation teaching. But Mary in Mormon culture is neglectful and lazy. I once elevated Mary's spirituality in a gospel doctrine class, trying to encourage deeper mindfulness and higher meaning and greater spiritual awareness. The bishop's wife stood up with fists clenched and bellowed, "Stop criticizing Martha. I love Martha. I am Martha." Yes, there is a pattern in the Gospels of Jesus going off to be alone to pray. The Aramaic word, I found this fascinating. The Aramaic word for prayer literally means to clear out a space in the forest so one can wait and watch. Alert, present moment awareness to catch game. So, what Phil is telling me, and he's a smart guy and I've got no reason to doubt him, is the Aramaic word for prayer is the same thing as going out hunting, clearing a space, getting up in a place where you can watch from cover and simply watching and waiting for the game to appear with all your senses focused on what's in front of you and what's around you. He goes on, Mormon teaching is hopelessly trapped in past and future. Past things to build testimony and future blessings to give meaning to the tedious present. Well, Phil writes a couple more paragraphs, but I'm going to leave it at that. And I want to go on now, since he's the one who brought up in that first comment he gave to me back in August. And as I say, a couple of days ago when I was going over this, I have replied to this by now, just so you know, to ask his permission to share what I did share. However, that comment that he made about the Truth and Light letter, and I had a little bit of extra time yesterday. I went to the Truth and Light letter on the internet, and I found a number of things that I want to share with you. This is, once again, not exhaustive on the Truth and Light letter. It is simply a first look. It's a look at the Truth and Light letter. And from what I have seen, I am not impressed. And here is my first slide. Not many slides today, I think just about 4 of them. But this is the Light and Truth letter. And I think I've been saying truth and light. I have been. It's the Light and Truth letter. Why is it that I get that mixed up? I must be dyslexic. Okay, it is the Light and Truth letter. That's right there. It says Austin Fife. It's the Light and Truth letter. So now we know. Okay, I'll try and remember. The Light and Truth letter as a title does sound better than the Truth and Light letter. So I like it better this way. I'll try and remember. It's the Light and Truth letter. And it is by Austin Fife. Here's Austin Fife. There's a picture of the gentleman there. He's the author of the Light and Truth letter. And he has been making the rounds with the usual suspects, i.e., the apologetics podcasts. He has been, I think, over at Psych Ward Radio. He's a regular over there, I think. And here's one in the upper right. Are you smarter? And apparently he was responding to anti-Mormon TikToks there. And here in the bottom right, they're going after John DeLynn. Debunked. Yeah, I'm sure he really debunked Mormon stories in that. And over here on the bottom left, exposing Latter-day Saint critics, Austin Fife, number 60, where he's holding very proudly his copy of his book, The Light and Truth Letter. By the way, when I say very proudly, it's no small thing to write a book. You're to be congratulated on that, Austin Fife, okay? It's a lot of words. They may not really say a whole lot. They may be trying to distract from issues more than address issues. But hey, it's a book, and you're to be congratulated nonetheless. Okay, so let me take that down and let me put up on the screen something else. What I want to put up on the screen now is what you find when you go to the Light and Truth letter on the internet. And here's what you find. It says, Dear critics of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, in 2014, I lost my faith. The Light and Truth letter is the culmination of my 10-year search for more light and truth. Well, nobody could object to that, could they? So let's go to read the Light and Truth letter. Hopefully this is showing up on the screen. And over here you can see in the middle is the Light and Truth letter, My Search for More Light and Truth by Austin Fife. And over here on the left are those different chapters that you can navigate through the book that Phil McLemore told me about. First is the cover and introduction. So if we scroll down from the cover, then we have a picture of Joseph Smith. It's in memory of E. Roland Brown, another title page, and now an introduction from August of 2024. So this is recent. Here is the brief introduction, and it runs as follows. An open letter to the CES Letter Foundation, Mormon Stories, and other critics of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Well, I guess that's me. Other critics, yes. So this is an open letter to me, Radio Free Mormon. In January of 2014, I lost my faith. I confessed to my wife that I no longer believed in God, much less a Church of Jesus Christ. The conversation hurt, but was a long time coming. My loss of faith was gradual and then all at once. It felt like my whole world had turned upside down. It hurt. I felt confused and lost. My wife's reaction surprised me. She did not panic or get defensive. No, not at all, I'm sure. Instead, she told me how excited she was for my faith journey. I thought I was leaving the church, but she reframed what I was feeling as the start of a journey. Then she made me a promise. If I could find more light and truth outside the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, she would follow me. And she meant it. I'm not sure how he knows that she meant it, but we'll let that go. It has been 10 years, he writes. I have read the CES letter several times and listened to many interviews on Mormon stories. I spent countless hours hearing and reading from ex-Mormons and other critical Christians. I have learned a lot in my honest and exhaustive 10-year search. Over time, I felt unsettled about atheism or agnosticism, and I discovered things that forced me to re-examine my unbelief. As a result of my search for more light and truth, some questions troubled me. The following issues are among my main concerns. And then it goes to the next chapter. Now, once again, I'm certainly not going to go through every chapter in this. In fact, I just want to go through this cover and introduction. Disclosures, I'll read. It's very short. Manipulation and fallacies, I'm going to touch on. And then I'm going to go directly to one chapter, which we'll talk briefly about for the balance of the podcast. And that's going to be the one on church finances. So let's go to the next chapter called Disclosures. During one 6-month period in 2024, I collected most of the X, Twitter, Reddit, and other social media or forum type comments quoted in this letter. Some comments have been hard to find again, or the original contributor removed them. I used brackets for clarity purposes without changing the intended meaning. Any particular comment is not important. I see the essence of every statement listed here almost daily on social media. My goal is not to make online commentators feel bad, but to illustrate the arguments of critics of the church online. Throughout the letter, I use the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Church of Jesus Christ, and the church interchangeably. I define the church like Elder D. Todd Christofferson does in his October conference, and he quotes it there. We don't need to go into that. I do not represent the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Always very important for people to say that, isn't it? The thoughts, opinions, and questions in this letter are my own. And then if you want to give feedback or contribute material, you can do it at this address, etc. It's a copyrighted under a Creative Commons attribution, and etc. So let's go to manipulation and fallacies. This is going to be interesting. Subtitled Questions and Concerns. And here he gives a few quotes, one from John DeLynn, one from Jeremy Reynolds, one from some Twitter user, another from another Twitter user. Then he gets into the body of what it is he has to say. I grew up in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I was baptized at 8, a missionary at 19, and married at 22. I graduated from BYU at 23. I am a right down the middle average member of the church. I served in various callings from several wards and stakes across the U.S. I never planned to have a faith crisis. Nobody ever plans to have a faith crisis, Austin, just like nobody ever expects the Spanish Inquisition. Most people who know me are surprised to hear that I seriously considered leaving the church. In the 10 years since I first admitted that I did not believe in God, I've seen other members leave the fold. Whenever I saw a social media post from a friend or family member outlining their decision to remove their names from the records of the church, it felt uncomfortable. The natural question would always surface: what do they know that I don't? Initially, during my faith crisis in 2014, I identified with the church's critics. I felt like we were a like-minded group of enlightened non-members. My experience in the church had been so positive that even when my doubts deepened, I was convinced that the church was a force for good in the world. Gradually, that changed. I started to believe the critics, and that is bolded here. I started to believe the critics. Austin, no, 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 no. You got that completely wrong, at least as far as I'm concerned. I do not ask you to believe me. I do not ask you to take my word for anything. What I do is I do research, I present facts, and then I give you my opinion based upon those facts, and you are free to accept or reject them if you think the facts do not support my opinion. That's all that I'm about. It is not about believing the critics. It is about looking at the evidence that is presented by critics, at least by this critic on this show. And I'm not the only one. He goes on, the more I heard from disillusioned members, the more I felt like maybe I was wrong about the Church of Jesus Christ. Maybe the church is much worse than I ever realized. I was ready to leave, but there was a problem. I am not sure when it happened, but eventually I started noticing a long list of techniques being employed against me by critics of the church. I could begin to see that I was being tricked into accepting false premises and half truths. Sorry, it's hard not to laugh when he says that, because that's what the church engages in. That is when I developed serious concerns about how critics made their case. By the way, this is something that I learned back in my early 20s. It was the early 1980s, and I'm getting into my study of anti-Mormonism in order to be a church apologist, which I was for 10 years plus. So I know all these arguments. I know pretty much all the responses to them by now. It's old hat for me. However, as part of that study, I was being taught by the apologists for the church that it was the critics of the church who used all these logical fallacies and would lie and would try and deceive me in order to make me think bad things about the church that weren't really there. Now, there were some occasions where I found that in some of the critics of the church. Yes, absolutely, I did. And I marked them and I noted them and I talked about them way back then. It's not on the podcast that I can remember. However, I knew it. The thing that shocked me, the thing that really shocked me was after 10 years of doing this, and then I start realizing over time that the church apologists, the ones who are defending the church, are using the exact same logical fallacies and methods of deception to try and keep people in the church. And that was a great shock and disappointment to me. And as between the two, I'd say the apologists win that hands down. They use more logical fallacies, they use more deceptive tactics than maybe even the critics of the church do against them. So all I'm saying is, yeah, both sides do it. It's good to be aware of it no matter who's using it, because logical fallacies are not going to get you closer to the truth. They're going to get you further from the truth. So it's a good idea to be able to identify them no matter who's using them and to prevent yourself from using them as well. He says, below is a list of tactics and fallacies I have identified over the years that many critics of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints use and why each is manipulative or wrong. Now, he separates this into two groups. One is manipulation tactic, and then he has a chart there with several different entries. And then he goes to a fallacy, a logical fallacy. He's got a lot of entries there. I'm not going to go through all of those. Now, I will go through a couple only because they will come up later. The first one that's funny, if a manipulation tactic can be funny, it's funny ironically because the very first one is called distrust in authority. So a manipulation tactic is to get you to distrust people who are in authority. And he writes under it, assuming that any institutional structure with a hierarchy is up to no good. Why is it manipulative? He says over here, this is designed to make the target distrust church leaders. The manipulator wins if the target believes they cannot trust the church. So this is a manipulation tactic here. But in his second group, fallacies, I wondered if he would have a very famous logical fallacy there. And indeed he does. Right there. Appeal to authority. Yes, a logical fallacy is an appeal to authority, and he correctly defines it as claiming that something must be true or false because it is believed or not by someone who is said to be in authority on the subject. That is a logical fallacy. So my question for Austin Fife is, how can an appeal to authority be a logical fallacy as it is, but trying to get someone to distrust those who are in authority is a manipulation tactic? If trusting those in authority is a logical fallacy, distrusting those in authority is a better way to find truth, not a manipulation tactic. Just wanted to point that out to you, Austin. Another thing that I thought was interesting is he certainly has under fallacies, he has a straw man. That's the first one. And of course, that's going to be used several times in his brief chapter about church finances, as it turns out. A straw man is to set up the opponent's argument to be weaker than it is, then proceed to demolish the false weak version and claim victory. Why it's wrong? It is dishonest. This is what Austin writes. It is dishonest because it does not genuinely engage with the opposing party's arguments. It may win points for the home team of like-minded people, but it does not bring anyone closer to the truth. Okay, so having looked at these entries here in his manipulation and fallacies, let's go to the church finances chapter. But before we get there, I want to tell you what happened with me yesterday morning as I was getting ready to prepare for today's show. I came to the lightandtruthletter.org. I looked through the things that I've already showed you. I did not look in any other chapter because I'm not going to read the whole damn thing just to do a podcast about it. What I figured was I'll look at his introductory material. I'll see what it has to say. And then I will pick one chapter at random to look at to see what he has to say about that subject. And the reason I picked church finances was because I wondered what Austin Fife in his Light and Truth letter would have to say about the Securities and Exchange Commission fiasco that the church had, which came to light in February of last year, 2023. And here it is, putting it up on the stage. It's a little bit small, and I apologize for that. It's hard for me to be able to increase the size of that. This is actually a screen that is on the internet, as opposed to a document that I've copied and pasted. So let me go to this, though, and read through it. This will refresh your memory. What this is the press release from February 21st, 2023. It is titled, SEC Charges the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and its investment management company for disclosure failures and misstated filings. I think most of you remember this. Let's just review this briefly, shall we? The Securities and Exchange Commission today announced charges against Ensign Peak Advisors, Inc., a nonprofit entity operated by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints to manage the church's investments, for failing to file forms that would have disclosed the church's equity investments, and for instead filing forms for shell companies, 13 of them, by the way, that obscured the church's portfolio and misstated Ensign Peak's control over the church's investment decisions. The SEC also announced charges against the church for causing these violations. Charges against the church. They were announced and resolved in the same press release, and the order was released the same day. The church agreed to the language of the order, and the church agreed to pay $1 million as a church as a fine to settle this, and $4 million from the EPA, the Ensign Peak Advisors Inc. account, which is wholly owned by the church. That contains the church's money and investment. $5 million total. The SEC also announced charges against the church for causing these violations. Let me repeat that again. That's very important. The SEC also announced charges against the church for causing these violations. The church caused them. To settle the charges, Ensign Peak agreed to pay a $4 million penalty, and the church agreed to pay a $1 million penalty. These are massive penalties for these kinds of 13F violations. Historically, these are the biggest that have ever been seen for those kind of violations. The SEC's order finds that from 1997 through 2019, that is over 20 years, Ensign Peak failed to file Forms 13F, the forms on which investment managers are required to disclose the value of certain securities they manage. According to the order, the church was concerned that disclosure of its portfolio, which by 2018 grew to approximately $32 billion, that's stocks in the U.S. stock market, approximately $32 billion, would lead to negative consequences, i.e. members deciding that they don't need to pay their tithing because the church already has more money than God. Those are the negative consequences that the church was concerned that disclosure of the amount of money that the church had would lead to. That's why it was kept hidden. That's why the church filed the fake 13Fs, created the 13 fake shell companies, and all the machinations they did to try and keep it a secret until finally a whistleblower came forward in 2018 or 19. An investigation was commenced by the Securities and Exchange Commission. It went on for several years, and this is the result of that investigation. To obscure the amount of the church's portfolio, this news release, this press release goes on, to obscure the amount of the church's portfolio, and with the church's knowledge and approval, and with the church's knowledge and approval, and with the church's knowledge and approval, Ensign Peak created 13 shell companies, ostensibly with locations throughout the U.S. Yeah, they weren't throughout the U.S. They had their addresses throughout the U.S. They were all in Salt Lake City in the same building where Ensign Peak was administered. That's where the people really were. These are fake companies. They are shell companies. They don't really exist except on paper in order to try and fool the federal government and the members of the church about how much money the church had. Not only did Ensign Peak, with the church's knowledge and approval, create 13 shell companies, they also filed 13F forms in the names of these companies rather than in Ensign Peak's name. The order finds that Ensign Peak maintained investment discretion over all relevant securities, that it controlled the shell companies, and that it directed nominee business managers, most of whom were employed by the church, to sign the commission filings. The shell companies and their forms 13F misstated, among other things, that the companies had sole investment and voting discretion over the securities when they did not. That was a lie. In reality, the SEC's order finds Ensign Peak retained control over all investment and voting decisions. The reason I keep emphasizing that is because all of these are violations of the law. We allege, quoting now from the order, I think, we allege that the LDS Church's investment manager, that's Roger Clark, with the church's knowledge, went to great lengths to avoid disclosing the church's investments, depriving the commission and the investing public of accurate market information, said Gerber S. Gruel, director of the SEC's Division of Enforcement. So I'm sorry, they're not quoting the order, they're quoting this individual. Continuing with the quote, the requirement to file timely and accurate information on Forms 13F applies to all institutional investment managers, including nonprofit and charitable organizations. End of his quote. Ensign Peak agreed to settle the SEC's allegation that it violated Section 13F of the Securities Exchange Act of 1934 and Rule 13F sub 1 thereunder by failing to file Forms 13F and for misstating information in these forms. The church agreed to settle the SEC's allegation that it caused Ensign Peak's violations through its knowledge and approval of Ensign Peak's use of the shell companies. Paul Find conducted the SEC's investigation under the supervision of Tracy Combs and Tanya Beard of the Salt Lake Regional Office and Laura Metcalf of the Denver Regional Office, last reviewed or updated February 21st, 2023. Now, the reason I went through that with you in detail, even though it was just the press release and I didn't go over the entire order, you can thank me later, is because I wanted to know. The question that came to my mind was, in this Light and Truth letter, the Truth and Light letter, in this Truth and Light letter, in their chapter on finances, what would Austin Fife say in response to this damning order, this fiasco that was exposed almost 2 years ago now in February of 2023 by the SEC? What would he have to say about that? And how would he explain that away? How would he defend it? And so we're still on manipulation and fallacies. Let's go to church finances. Here it is. And what I was honestly shocked to find out, is that in his chapter on church finances, questions and concerns, Austin Fife deals with this issue by ignoring it. I'm serious. He doesn't mention the SEC fiasco, the order from the SEC that the church had been involved in filing false documents for over 20 years with the federal government in order to keep its members from knowing it had billions and billions of dollars in the bank, because it was concerned that the members might think that they didn't really need to pay tithing, or at least not a full tithing, to a church that had that much money. Now, that was $36 billion then in the U.S. stock market. It's over $40 billion now. And once again, it's important to remember that this is just money in the stock market. It's not all the money they have in the Ensign Peak investment account. There's over $150 billion sitting there in that account, being invested, of course, but sitting there doing no good to anybody, even though it is money that has been made from the tithing and donations of the members in order to have, hopefully, good done in the world. Instead, it's just sitting there like a dragon's hoard, doing nothing except being set upon by the top 15. And they're not using it for any good purpose. The only 2 times there have apparently been money that has gone out of the EPA account is not to do good for people who need it. Instead, one was to help build the City Creek Mall, a for-profit venture, by the way, that the church did in downtown Salt Lake City. And also when money went out to Beneficial Life, a church-owned insurance company, which was in danger of becoming insolvent. So money was taken out of the Ensign Peak account to help stabilize Beneficial Life. That's it, as far as I know. Those 2 things, nothing else. It's been sitting there for 20 years. Now, the church does do some good every now and again, and it does it with the money that's coming in as fresh tithing, but they have about $7 billion a year coming in fresh tithing every year. The church's expenses are around $6 billion, which means they have $1 billion overage that they can use for whatever it is they need. It doesn't cover expenses. They can donate it here. Remember, $1 billion is $1,000 million. $1 billion is $1,000 million. So they can take some of that money, donate it here, donate it there, and any that they don't donate goes back into the Ensign Peak account and continues to accrue interest. All right, so as I said, this was shocking to me that he does not address this. And by the way, I thought, maybe he addresses it somewhere other than in this chapter. This is where I would expect it to be, in church finances. Maybe he addressed it somewhere else. So there is a search function in the letter. And I put securities in there. Nope, nothing comes up. I put exchange in there. Nothing comes up. I put SEC in there, and nothing comes up except where SEC is used as a part of a word like section. So SEC would come up with section or other words like that, or second, but there was no SEC as in the Securities and Exchange Commission abbreviation anywhere in this Light and Truth letter. So I'm not sure if it's the Light and Truth letter or if it's the Light on Truth letter. Oh, yeah, that one I've got to remember. This is the Light on Truth letter. Because what this tells me is, first off, you're not being honest with your audience, Austin. If you're not going to talk about or even mention one of the biggest scandals the church has had in the last 50 to 100 years, and I'm talking about the SEC scandal from February of 2023, how can I trust you that you're going to talk about anything that's important? In other words, if you're going to hide this, what else are you going to hide? Because of this, I cannot trust you. You are an unreliable narrator. So I have to take that into account. In other words, if I'm going to read something, why should I read it if I know that I have to check you at every turn? That not only may you be telling me things that are not complete, but you may be completely avoiding telling me some things altogether. That's the first thing I have to say. Okay, so having said that, let's see what you do say here about church finances. He says, recently, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints has received increased criticism of its finances. Yeah, that's when we found out that it has over $150 billion in the Ensign Peak account. He goes on, I'll admit that when I learned that the church's investment portfolio may exceed $100 billion, yeah, it does, and it exceeds it by a lot, I was unsure how to feel. No, you knew how to feel, but you didn't want to let yourself feel that way. That's what was happening, Austin. He goes on, then I learned more. The church has been near bankruptcy about every 20 to 30 years between 1830 and the 1960s. He says the church has endured every financial crash, depression, and major economic downturn in the last 200 years while still providing essential religious services and growing internationally. Now, Austin, this is all a red herring. You have that under your list of logical fallacies as well. I saw it there. This is also a straw man. This is also a non sequitur. This has nothing to do with the issue of the fact that currently the church has over $150 billion sitting in an account and they're not doing anything with it. The history of the church, the fact it may have been near bankruptcy 50 years ago, 60 years ago, has nothing to do with what's going on right now. He asked the question, where were the critics when the saints lost their homes and land in Missouri? That has nothing to do with the issue, Austin. He asked another question. Did the critics cheer on the Latter-day Saints when they were on the brink of financial failure? I don't know. But one thing I know, that has nothing to do with the issue, Austin. He goes on talking about the Great Depression. So what he's trying to do is just give a history of the finances of the church, which has nothing to do, as you know, with what's going on today. This is trying to distract. This is trying to create something for you to look at so you're not focusing on the issue, which he's never really going to get around to, by the way. Big surprise there. He leaves it by saying, do the critics not realize that the church's financial success is a recent phenomenon? Yeah, it's in the last 20 years. You've got over $150 billion. Do something with it, damn it. You claim to be Jesus Christ's one and only church. Why don't you help the people that Jesus helped? And why don't you help the people that Jesus commanded his apostles to help? That's my question. You have the means, you just don't have the desire. You have the money, you just don't have the faith. He asked this question, isn't the turnaround of the church's finances miraculous? Wonderful? Can't the church do so much more good now that it is on a stable financial footing? Oops, he went too far there. Isn't the turnaround of the church's finances miraculous? Sure it is, but they're not doing anything with it. He went too far when he asked, can't the church do so much more good now? Yes, it can. The problem is it's not. That's the issue, Austin. That is the entire issue, and it is the one issue that you are avoiding addressing, even though you actually asked the question here in your book. He goes on, critics complain that the Church of Jesus Christ still requires 10% tithing on members' increase, even though the church is much more financially stable. No, it's not much more financially stable. It is completely financially stable. If you have over $150 billion, okay, you are more than financially stable. Until recently, haven't church members contributed additional funds and money above and beyond tithing to construct local church buildings and temples? Well, yeah, back in the 1980s, we were asked to pay a little bit extra for the building fund. Yes, I remember that. And then he says, isn't it safe to say that the church requires less of us now than ever? So you see, it's a good thing that the church has over $150 billion in the account that they're not doing anything with to help the poor and the needy, because we don't have to pay as much to the church as we used to. Yeah, that's called a non sequitur. You have all of these logical fallacies at the beginning of your book, Austin. How come you can't identify them when you're using them? Now he's going to go on to something else, the welfare program of the church. And here he's going to go through all the different things that the church claims it's done, okay, in 2023. What you have to understand is nobody is saying that the church isn't doing anything, Austin. What we're saying is the church has over $150 billion in the bank that's doing nothing except rotting and corrupting the souls of the top 15, as well as the presiding bishopric. So the top 18, maybe. It is corrupting and cankering their souls. It's not doing any good to anybody. Now, there's all sorts of issues, and we've gone over those in the past about how the church does its accounting and how it puts dollar signs or dollar numbers on volunteer hours from church members in order to make it look like they're actually donating a lot more than they really are. The whole thing is this. Nobody is saying the church isn't doing a little bit compared to the vast amounts it has. Nobody's saying it's not. What we're saying is it should be doing more, and the numbers prove that that's the case. So when you're going about the welfare program of the church, you're responding to an argument that was never made by me or by any other critic that I know. That is by definition, and it's your definition that you used at the beginning of your book. That's a straw man argument. That's what you're doing right here. And you're doing it very well, I must say. Then you go to socioeconomic status of members of the church. And what you want to point out is that members of the church tend to make more money than other people in other religions, and that they tend to be more educated than other people in other religions. You ask the question, why are more devoted members of the church more likely to be educated? And then you ask the question, why do members of the church make more money than non-religious people do? You have a whole section devoted to this, and yet it has nothing to do with the issue. I'm not sure what this is supposed to be addressing. Is it supposed to be bragging about the prosperity gospel, that Mormons tend to make more money than any other religion? It has nothing to do with answering any questions. I think this section raises more concerns than it resolves. Now he goes to the unpaid clergy, okay? And we know all about the unpaid clergy. I was baptized in 1978. I joined the church being taught by the missionaries that the LDS church has no paid clergy. The missionaries don't get paid. The bishop doesn't get paid. The stake president doesn't get paid. The general authorities, so the 70 don't get paid. The apostles don't get paid. And the president of the church doesn't get paid. That's what I was taught. That's what everybody in this church was taught. And it was taught expressly by leaders of the church, even in general conference and also in the different church manuals, which they read and approved for being sent out to the members of the church so that they could study and learn from them what the church was really about. It was an unpaid ministry over and over and over again. That's what we were told. The problem is that wasn't true. The top leaders of the church were making money, and they were making good money, while at the same time telling us they weren't making any money at all. That's the issue. How does Austin Fife respond to this issue? Here's what he says. 99% plus of the church's leaders are unpaid. There are over 35,000 congregations with a bishop or branch president unpaid. There are over 3,500 stakes with the stake president unpaid, et cetera, et cetera. So he goes through all the people who are not paid. And then he says millions of other members serving callings or on missions unpaid, blah, blah, blah. And then he says, isn't it safe to say that the church essentially has an unpaid clergy? No, it's not. Because an unpaid clergy means nobody gets paid. That's what it means. Not essentially, not basically, not more or less. The church, if it has an unpaid clergy, means that nobody in the church who is operating in a clerical manner gets paid. None of the clergy gets paid, and that includes the 70, the apostles, and the president of the church. But that's not true. And it wasn't true even when I was being taught that it was true. So he says, isn't it safe to say that the church essentially has an unpaid clergy? This would be a great motto for the church. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. We're honest most of the time. That's what he's arguing for. He goes on to say, the 100 or so church leaders who do receive compensation, oh, there we are. The 100 or so church leaders who do receive compensation receive a modest salary. Yeah, he's going to bring that up again from Gordon B. Hinckley. Was it back in 1997 when Gordon B. Hinckley said that because Time magazine started finding out the truth? That in spite of their protestations that they weren't getting paid, that they actually were. So Gordon B. Hinckley goes out in front of General Conference and says, yeah, we receive a modest stipend is actually what it was. It wasn't a modest salary. It was a modest stipend. He then goes on with some other questions which have nothing to do with the issue. Does anyone aspire to become a church leader for all that cash? That has nothing to do with it. The issue isn't whether I believe, or any critic believes, that leaders of the church should be paid. I agree they should be paid. Most people I know agree that they should be paid. The issue isn't whether they should be paid. The issue is whether they should lie and say that they're not being paid when in fact they are being paid. Austin Fife goes on in a similar vein with ridiculous questions. Shouldn't the critics ask why we call people in their 60s and 70s to work 6 days a week for long hours for a modest salary? Isn't that elder abuse? Shouldn't they be making more? I'm wondering if Brad Wilcox wrote this part of his letter, his book with these ridiculous questions. These are actually Wilcoxian in their ridiculousness, these questions. Why aren't there more petitions from critics demanding that the general authorities have more days off? That is so Brad Wilcox. Oh my gosh. We got to keep that one around just when we need a chuckle. Okay, so the whole problem with this is that he keeps talking about a modest salary, which was a modest stipend originally. Now they've changed it to modest salary from what it was that Gordon B. Hinckley actually said. So apparently Austin Fife is not aware of how much it is that the general authorities actually get paid. Because if he did, I've got a feeling that he wouldn't be saying that it's modest, because it's anything but modest. It's actually immodest. Let me put that up on the screen here. This is from wasmormon.org. It is the pay stub of Henry B. Eyring, who was an apostle at the time when this pay stub was received by him in 1999. This was originally leaked by Mormon Leaks, so I want to certainly give them credit for it. And it was a number of years ago. This isn't news. Austin Fife should be aware of this. In fact, one thinks he probably is. But once again, just like the SEC order, he's not going to mention it because it tends to make his arguments fall flat. Once again, we can't trust this guy. This is the pay stub. And down below the pay stub itself, we have a recapitulation in more legible form of what it is that Elder Eyring received. Reimbursements of $5,422. So apparently he can just keep his receipts, hand them into the church, and he gets reimbursed to the tune of $5,422 for this pay period. A child allowance of $76.92. A living allowance of $2,211.53. And a parsonage of $730.77. Now, once again, remember, this is 1999. Things have gone up inflation-wise and price-wise a lot since then. And so has President Eyring's salary. The salary here, there's no salary mentioned, you'll notice. So he really doesn't make a salary. He just makes a total of $7,864.04 for other categories. How nice. Notice this is not a month. This is just a 2-week period, this pay stub. It is from April 17th of 1999 to April 30th of 1999. Henry Eyring is definitely going to party like it's 1999 with all that cash. So that is $7,864. If we can round that up to $8,000 just for me and my math, which skills, which are not that great, $8,000, that's for 2 weeks. So we have to multiply it by 2. Actually, that's okay. $8,000, that's for 2 weeks. So in order to find out what he is netting for the entire year, we have to take the 8,000, we have to multiply it by 24. It would be 12 if it were for a month, but it's only for 2 weeks. So there's 52 weeks in the year. We got to multiply 8 by 24. And let's see what we get. 8 times 4 is equal to 32, carry a 3, 16. It's $192,000 that Henry Eyring was making in 1999. Is that true? I got to look at this again because that seems like a lot. Okay, I think that my math is correct. I've been looking at it here. It seems incredible that Henry Eyring, as a member of the Quorum of the 12, and my understanding is that all the other different general authorities make the same amount. Okay, that's my understanding. I'm not positive, but that means all the apostles, including the first presidency, as well as the 70, are making the same amount. It was $192,000 back in 1999. That is base pay. They get so much else that is provided for them. All the benefits, the transportation, the car, the limo, the driver, everything. But this is base pay. This is basically just fun money for them that they can use to buy whatever it is that they want. $16,000 a month, $192,000 a year. We'll round it down since we rounded up from 7864 to 8,000. We'll round this down from 192 just to $190,000. Okay, that is a nice chunk of change, and that was in 1999. It is now 25 years later. Let me see if I can find out what $190,000 from 1999 would be today. So the first thing to note is that according to my inflation calculator, which you can access on your computer too, wow, $190,000 in 1999 is equivalent in purchasing power to about $360,000 today. $360,000 today. The church gives cost of living increases and allowances, the COLA, every year to all of its apostles and to all of its general authority 70. They're not going to let them fall behind the times. They're not going to let them lose purchasing power. So it is my estimation that Henry Eyring is now making $360,000 a year minimum. And so are all the other apostles, $360,000 a year. So are all the other members of the 70, $360,000 a year minimum, which means I believe that they're making $30,000 a month because 3 times 12, yep, 36. $30,000 a month. That means when they get this paycheck now for a 2-week period, it's not for $8,000, it's for $15,000. Wow. This is why when people criticize me for asking for donations, because it's what I live off of for producing the show, I respond, I will not rest until I make at least as much as an apostle of Jesus Christ. And believe me, I've still got a long way to go to catch up to them. And we will go back to the last part of this chapter on finances in the Truth and Light letter, or as I call it, the Light on Truth letter. It's kind of light on the truth, isn't it? So going down to church finances conclusion in this final paragraph, Austin writes, it's easy to only see dollar signs. Yeah, 150 billion of those dollar signs. I've come to see, he says, I've come to see the widow's mite. Strange he would use that term. I've come to see the widow's mite of millions of faithful Latter-day Saints across generations to build up the kingdom of God on the earth. I see honest and good stewards of that money. You do? Well, apparently you're not looking at the facts. You know, the reason you can see honest and good stewards of that money is because you failed to tell your audience in your book about the SEC fiasco. Yeah, you can see honest and good stewards of the money if you avoid looking at the facts and if you hide them so that the people that you're writing your book to won't know about it either. He writes, I see honest and good stewards of that money making the most of those sacred funds. No, now you're totally in la la land, Austin. That's ridiculous. Most importantly, I see how temperance and sacrifice have blessed the lives of countless members of the church, including my own. Okay, well, whatever. I think you need a new prescription for your glasses because you're not seeing things very clearly, at least not to my way of thinking. Okay, that's about all for tonight. Once again, I want to do a conclusion now on this particular letter, the Light on Truth letter, or the Truth and Light letter. The thing is this: I picked legitimately one chapter at random to review. And I found not only that the author, Austin Fife, had omitted and neglected to include the biggest scandal that the church has been involved in financially, probably since its inception, maybe as big as the Kirtland bank fiasco. But he omits it. He doesn't bring it up because he doesn't want you to know about it, which also tells me, by the way, that this is such a big scandal that even Austin doesn't have a good answer for it. If he had a good answer for it, he'd include it and present the answer. I expect that after this podcast airs and I have made it known that he has hidden this from his readers, that he will include it together with some kind of tepid reason why it's okay for these good leaders who are such good stewards of the Lord's money to do this kind of thing, to file fraudulent documents with the federal government, to create fake companies, 13 of them, in order to hide the amount of money that the church has from its members so that they will continue to pay tithing and the church can make more money, which will go into the Ensign Peak account. It will grow bigger and bigger, and they will just continue to sit on it and not do anything with it. Okay, so if we have a letter like this that in one chapter is so problematic, and we've seen the other problems in this one chapter, I've gone through them briefly here. I have no desire to go through anything else in this book because I already know I can't trust the author, Austin Fife. He's not honest. He is doing what the church always does, which is hiding things, which is slanting things, which is using straw man arguments, which is trying to get you to look over here instead of at the issue itself. That's what he's about. And I expect that's what every other chapter in his book is about. And I have got no time to go after that kind of ridiculousness. He's not a serious person. It's not a serious book. So thank you for watching tonight. I hope that you have enjoyed tonight's show. Please hit like. Please hit subscribe. Let's increase our number of subscribers if we can. And thank you to all of my listeners who have gone the extra mile and gone to radiofreemormon.org and made a donation there. Your donations are keeping Radio Free Mormon broadcasting behind enemy lines. Once again, that's about all for tonight. Thanks so much for watching. This is Radio Free Mormon, signing off the air.